Um, my name is Blake. I'm a technical lead at an agency called Convert Digital. Just out of curiosity, I want to ask you guys a simple question or a couple of questions. Could you raise your hand if you work client side for a merchant? Anyone here works for a client as a developer? Yeah, a few of you. And if you work for an agency, can you raise your hand? All right, sweet. Anyone who works for an agency, if you could just walk out that door. These are trade secrets? No. I'm super stoked to be here. This is actually my first Unite, and having the opportunity to speak is something that I'm really grateful for. So I just want to thank Shopify for that. So that's me. I thought before we dive into performance, which is a really broad topic, and I've only got so much time to talk about it, I'd give you a little background about who I am. So I lead development teams in Australia and beyond. Big part of my role is working on Shopify Plus stores and also headless stores. A big part of my role is actually the productization of development. So Convert Digital works with a number of clients, and obviously as developers, we're trying to identify opportunities where we can increase the velocity of our teams and reducing the amount of code that we have to rewrite. Prior to working at Convert Digital, I worked in a product-based company, so productization of development is something that I'm super passionate about. And a part of that also comes with a lot of research and innovation. So internally, we have a number of projects that we're working on. Our own Webpack builder, introducing Tailwind to all of our new stores that we're building. Something that comes out of, I guess, late nights of research and trying things out on different stores. And obviously optimizing websites. So to the detriment of some projects that we work on, I'm kind of the gatekeeper for what launches with us. Anything that launches that we build at Convert Digital goes through a pretty grueling testing process when it comes to performance. And we're going to talk about a few of those things today. So these are some of the clients that we work with. Probably the ones that I'll call out. Tiger Lily 2.0 store, we launched with them. We got that store out really quick, and they've seen some great success. Gander and Newtime actually are two headless stores that we built with Next.js that are hosted on Vercel Enterprise. Super passionate about those projects. I'm not talking about headless development today. I'm talking about theme stuff, but if you do, or if you are interested in headless development or anything around performance, please reach out and connect with me. I'm really passionate about it, and I love meeting developers that are as well. So for performance, in the time that I do have, I'm going to present a scenario to you. So let's say you work at an agency, which looks like most of us do, and a client says, hey, we want to look at our performance. An SEO agency that's just reached out to us has said, our performance needs to be looked at, or we're realizing that our page score and our load time's gone up. Can you actually have a look at this and identify opportunities? So one of the things that we try and focus on, and what I try to tell our team members all the time, is let's try and focus on things that we can actually can control. So Shopify is this beautiful platform where we have a lot of control over a lot of things. There's also things that we don't have control. And recently, and very fortunately, Shopify has become a lot more on top of third-party applications and how they're more development and performance focused. That's less of a problem now than it was a few years ago. But what we try and focus on is things like code, working with merchants to make sure that they're actually doing the right things, particularly around media. The other week, we had a merchant upload an 18-megabyte GIF file to their homepage and said, why is my website slow? I'm sure everyone's dealt with that before. Anyway, so first steps. What are all these metrics? Now, I'm not going to talk about every single metric here and how you can optimize a website for each one. That's going to take a lot more than the 15 or so minutes that I actually have. We're going to talk about a very specific couple of metrics. But I'm sure everyone's seen this screen before, and it's a massive bummer. And the main thing is this score doesn't necessarily reflect the actual speed and performance of the store that the consumers are actually getting. So if you think about it, this is always the worst case scenario. Google's really brutal. This website's scoring a 36, and its actual load time really isn't that bad. 4 seconds in the grand scheme of things, particularly coming back from where web development's been over the past 10 years. I'm sure everyone remembers the WordPress days where everyone was rocking a WordPress store. Those sites were slow. We're definitely getting a lot faster these days. Front-end development's getting more complex. Developers have more tools these days. And Google is keeping developers accountable for performance, particularly by introducing a degree of SEO ranking that can be attributed to these scores. So this is a really cool slide, and I constantly look at these metrics because it changes with each version of Lighthouse. But the different metrics that you're getting ranked against, the metrics that contribute to your total score, this is the weighting. So it's really easy to identify that there are some things that you should be looking at before others. So the two that we're going to be focusing on today is time to interactive and total blocking time. It's just lightly touched on by Scott yesterday, so that's really fortunate. So total blocking time is essentially the total amount of time between the FCP and the total time to interactive. And time to interactive is obviously when the website's ready to go and be interacted with. So the prompts that you're often given, and what we look at immediately, is we look at JavaScript. It's the biggest thing that can affect websites here. And we look at asynchronous and deferred loading of third-party scripts, and the reduction of JavaScript file sizes. And of course, code, review, and refactor where you can. So we go back to things that, all right, well, what can we actually control? As I said before, if you don't have a image component or an image snippet which is handling the resizing of images based on browser size, something you should look into. Audit third-party apps as soon as you take on a new merchant. What we do at Convert is if someone comes to us, we haven't built their website, we actually do like a traffic light system where it's like green apps, they're being used, they have to stay on the site, the client wants to keep them. Yellow, kind of using it, or they could be re-implemented a little bit better. And red, not being used, or this doesn't need to be turned on right now because it's affecting performance. Fonts as well, it's a big thing that can affect page speed. It's a big asset. A lot of merchants will have a theme that has been built out of the box, so they've purchased it from somewhere, and they'll have fonts they're not utilizing, which is actually being called in as part of a CDN call, and it's not even being really presented on the site itself. And what we're going to focus on today is actually theme code, because there's a lot of developers here, and I thought that would be cool. So this is a really weird topic to talk about. We're talking about carousels at a theme performance convention, talk. But I wanted to talk about something really specific that I think everyone in this room can relate to. Most e-commerce stores have carousels, and traditionally, carousels are above the fold. They've been implemented with a third party or a dedicated library or module, and they come with a lot of bloat. Beyond being above the fold, carousels are being used even more across websites. So they're on product pages you may also like. They're on mini cart upsells, cart upsells. Now we're even seeing them on 404 pages to make sure that customers are getting an experience, with no dead ends. So if you can fix your carousels, you'll be surprised actually at the impact on performance. It's pretty substantial. So there's a way you can build carousels without JavaScript, and this is kind of recent. And if you haven't heard of CSS Scroll Snap, I recommend you do some reading on it. Essentially what it is, it's basically a new CSS attribute where you can have a parent component and a series of child components, and it handles the overflow of the scroll. And the child components basically have an anchor tag, think of it that way, that the scroll can actually snap to. So here's some code. So this isn't a big, complicated section. It's really, really basic. All you really need to notice is that there's a section wrapper, a container, there's two buttons for navigation left and right, and then there's a for loop, which is rendering out a product card. And there's a little screenshot of what we've got. This is probably the most important slide. So at this point, which is, can't see on the slides because my eyes aren't that great, but it's roughly around 40 or 35 lines of code. At this point, you actually have a working carousel just with this code. And the things that you need to be looking at is the mandatory X scroll and the starting position of the scroll snap as well. So at this point, you actually have a carousel that on a mobile, you can have gesture interaction. On a computer, on a desktop, you can click and drag on the carousel, and it will snap into position. So if you want to go a little bit further, now we've started our little navigation buttons on the left and right. This is the only JavaScript that you could want to add, which will make the actual carousel snap and move between each product card if you clicked on the left and right arrows. So this is really, really basic JavaScript. It's not using jQuery. It's using an event listener for the click on each buttons. And at this stage, you actually have a working carousel with a very, very small amount of code. So that entire carousel library that you would have used previously can be completely removed from your website. Now, we've done a really, really basic implementation there just for product cards. You can go further with that. You can add dot point navigation. You can add auto scrolling, kind of like a marquee effect, which you would see traditionally on a homepage at the top of the screen. But that section is really, really simple, and it's something that you can implement today. So what we did just then was this thing that I'm really passionate about, and it's a big part of like React-based development, is the concept called code splitting. And I don't know how long everyone in this room's been working with Shopify, but way back when, and we'll touch on this in a little bit, there used to be this thing called like theme.js and theme.scss files, and the entire JavaScript for the entire store would be in a single file, and it'd take ages to load. So what is code splitting? Code splitting is essentially the idea of only loading in JavaScript or CSS, or reducing the amount of JavaScript and CSS into small bits when you only need to use it. So the idea of this and why it's necessary is, well, as an application gets more and more complex, the JavaScript is increasing, the amount of classes that you might be using in CSS is increasing, and if you have everything living in a giant file, well then basically what happens is everything just gets slower and slower and slower over time. So to prevent this from happening, you split your files up into small bits of code, and when a section's being rendered on a storefront, it's only calling the JavaScript and the CSS files that's necessary when that section appears on the page. There's no reduce unused CSS or reduce unused JavaScript loading warnings anymore when you approach development in this way. So theme.js, back to this. This is actually a screenshot of one of the stores that we've taken on in the past few months. This is actually not the worst one. I remember a couple of years back, we took on a client. They had an out-of-the-box theme that they purchased from the store. The theme.js file was 10,000 lines of JavaScript, unminified, which was pretty terrifying. And probably the worst thing for developers is when you have a file like this, it loads on every single page. There's lots of JavaScript that's in that file that's not being used. When you make a change on something, you might actually be impacting the entire site. So there were changes particularly around bundling logic when we were making updates. We were making changes that we were expecting to happen on the product page, but they're happening everywhere. And it was really, really confusing. So basically the principle is, if you have a new section or a snippet that you're going to be working on, and you have this existing file with a ginormous amount of JavaScript in it, start proactively bringing your code across to, I would say, section-driven programming, where you've got a JavaScript file, a CSS file for each section or component. I've got some structure there, so if you've got a Webpack build like we do, you can bundle everything into the same directory, or if you're just using a standard Shopify theme that doesn't have that, there's a structure there as well. So what do these changes actually do? So by implementing these changes on a development store that we have, amongst taking that approach to development across other different types of components like the mega menu, navigation, mini cart, for example, those are really, really easy ones that you can do this strategy with. The results were actually pretty massive. So the time to interactive went from 5.8 seconds down to 1.9, which is pretty cool. So the idea of code splitting and the idea of only using JavaScript and CSS where it's needed, coupled with implementing things like Tailwind or Post-CSS bundler, has a massive impact on performance. So to summarize, there's loads of opportunities when it comes to performance. Code is one aspect of it. Looking at new opportunities, such as using CSS frameworks like Tailwind and utilizing technology or concepts like tree shaking. Minimizing unnecessary libraries and applications is also a really, really big thing. So if you're identifying that a merchant has got applications that have been installed and uninstalled, but there's still code that's firing to interact with a JavaScript CDN or something like that that's existing in the code still, review that, remove it. And the other thing that we see, and we've learned from this a lot, is make small changes and deploy often. We've done a lot of optimization of websites before, where we've done a massive amount of changes, in concurrence with developing new features. And then you have two branches, one that's like massively optimizing and you've changed a lot of the JavaScript and how the CSS works. Then the guys working on like the new feature for the client has been working at the same time. And then we go, all right, let's deploy, let's make a PR and get this out to production. And then we go, oh, yeah, those conflicts are pretty scary. So make small changes, test often. The other thing as well is when you make a lot of changes, when you're looking at performance, if you're going over and rebuilding your entire theme, trying to get it onto even more of a section sort of focused like system, if you do everything all on one go and then something breaks, it's really hard to identify why did this just break. So if you're going to start doing this, my recommendation is to focus on very small parts of the site, deploy, wait, test out that it works okay, and then keep going from there. And also with that, from an SEO perspective, is you can start identifying immediately what's actually having impact from that score that's being sent around a lot these days. So that's pretty much the end of my talk. That QR code doesn't go to like any review or like rate my talk, anything. That goes to my LinkedIn. I'm really happy to be here, and I think it's awesome that Shopify is actually hosting an event like this in Melbourne. I'm really passionate about development. I love Shopify. I love headless development. If you're passionate about development, please connect with me. I'd love to talk to you. Thank you. And we do have time for Q&A, so if you have any questions.
Hey, I'm just wondering if you have any experience with like grey hat methods of beating page speed scores.
Don't do it.
So something, just an example. So we did a thing where we would delay Google Tag Manager loading until there was like mouse movement on the page.
Okay, so this is quite topical, and that like if you're on Twitter, it's not a very Australian thing, but if you're on Twitter, there's some really vocal engineers out there that are on this topic. A lot of people try and hack this, and Google's $1 trillion company, and they've kind of got the best people in the world working on their products. They know, and you will be penalized for it. There is one thing that we do, for example, and it's identifying things that actually do need to be on the page at first instance and things that can come later. I would say GTM is one thing that would need to be there because it can affect analytics. What I will say, to the detriment of chat widgets, is that typically chat widgets aren't the most optimized tools that are out there, and they do have a big impact on page performance. So one thing that we do is we don't make a call or request to get the JavaScript or load that chat widget in until the customer actually interacts with the DOM. So the DOM being the document object model. So if someone starts scrolling or they click on something, we'll actually call to make that request to get that chat widget in. Just by doing that, you'll be amazed how much that score jumps up. But don't mess with analytics stuff. That's important. Any other questions?
Have you played much with tools or solutions like PartyTown that move third-party scripts to web workers and concepts around that? And
actually haven't, no. I'd be interested to have a look at that. We try and do everything, we try and not over-engineer things, where you look at utilizing the existing tools that Shopify has. What we do is when we see functionality that might be implemented by an application that's really, really basic, which actually might be affecting performance, but also from a cost point of view for our merchants, we'll actually review and see like, how can we actually build this as a service ourselves? Like, because when you've got control of building out those third parties, we can do a serverless function or something like that to do logic. But no, we haven't looked into that. But that's a really interesting point, and I will look into that.
Cool. I think it's by builder.io.
Sweet, thanks. Yeah. Any more questions? I'm really nervous. That's one person I wouldn't want to ask me a question.
So I worked on the Lighthouse team. I'm just kidding. Hydrogen is doing stuff with PartyTown, just so you know. So we're trying to optimize it within Hydrogen as well. And Next is doing interesting things there. Next 13 released yesterday. Remix is doing really interesting things there. How do you integrate with like CI/CD and like build a performance culture so it's like always keeping things fast, not just, you talked a little bit about some of this in small PRs and this and the other,
Yep.
but what do you do there?
That is a really, really good question. So fortunately, obviously with the GitHub integration that Shopify has, that pain point has been taken away from developers. So there's a really good question that was asked yesterday about GitLab and the support that Shopify had with GitLab. We actually built this as part of our deployment process because we recognized with Shopify merchants, and this is a feature request, it'd be great to not let merchants edit code. If you could somehow put that into the next product release, that'd be awesome.
Maybe we could give them a test first.
Yeah,
you know,
just
like you
you
have to
know,
answer a few questions. And
I work with an agency button. That's what we need. So what we did is we realized that we were making deployments, merchants were making changes to their theme code, but they were going like, hey, we just made this edit, like where did it go? And then it would cause this big discussion. So now part of our deployment process is, well, we need to build, and at the time, we first did it on GitLab, then we tried it out with Bitbucket, and we made our own pipeline runner, which was basically like, all right, we're going to use the API, we're going to fetch the theme from the live site, we're going to compare it to our dist file. If there's any differences, don't deploy. Obviously, we only deploy to an offline theme, so we can make sure that we're testing before we actually push the publish button. But from a deployment process, fortunately with like in the headless space, obviously you've got the idea of like connecting with something like Vercel, where you've got that integration out of the box for branches and you get preview deployments. But for Shopify themes, my recommendation, my answer to that would be is like use the GitHub integration. It works and it's great. Is that what you wanted me to say? Yeah, cool. Yeah. There you go. Any other questions? No? Cool. All right. Well, please reach out. I love talking about tech. So, sweet. Thank you.